We get ready here now. This morning I wanted to sing "America the Beautiful." It's kind of poignant. Here we're coming on the anniversary of two major things. One is the end of the War of 1812, which was the birth of the national anthem, written by Francis Scott Key, who was captive on a British vessel at the Battle of Baltimore. And more important, I think, is how that changed, that war changed how those people looked at the United States and Britain, and how each of those countries looked differently at each other. And then we come up to the anniversary that our generation maybe is more akin to is September 11th, which is coming up this week. And this Sunday, what I want you to do is think a little bit about where were you when those two planes crashed into the World Trade Center, which has only been a little over 10 years ago. What about when that plane crashed into the Pentagon? Where were you? Where were you when that plane crashed into that beautiful old minefield in Shanksville, Pennsylvania? Where were you? If we think back, it's a period of time that defines who we are, who we were, and what our priorities are, doesn't it? On the 10th of September, over 10 years ago, I, like most of you, was very busy with life. I was finishing up my undergraduate work at the University of South Carolina. I would think a lot of myself and taking my family, my friends, and my life in general for granted. Then came the morning of September 11th. I was home finishing up a paper on Stoic writers of the South. And I was home finishing up this paper, and Mary was in class at the time. She was also finishing up her undergraduate. And I had the news playing behind me. We had a TV on top of our box that held our hot water heater. And I had a huge TV up there, and I was listening to Fox News in the morning, and all of a sudden came the report about a plane crash. And when I heard about it and I saw what had happened, the first thing I did was I called Mary on her cell phone. And at that time we had these little Nokia phones that the only game you could play was Snake. You remember that? We had to go around with the ones, the fives, the threes, or the eights to move the snake around. I mean, that's the extent of cell phones. And I'm calling Mary, and her being a good student, she had her cell phone off during class. So I called the school, the University of South Carolina, over to the hallway. And they were all, this was news to them. I said, turn on the TV. We've been invaded. So I kept texting Mary. And you remember in those times, the texting wasn't quite as easy as it is now. You had to hit, if you were going to do S, you had to hit that 7 4 times to get the letter S out there. And I was texting Mary. And I was also texting our daughter, who was at Buford High School at the time, and sending emails and checking on them. My priorities, like your priorities, had changed back to where they were supposed to be. Back to where they were supposed to be. I watched, like most of you, in horror as people were seen dropping from both of those amazing buildings. I had taken for granted to always be part of the New York skyline with those twin towers. As a Boy Scout, I remember taking trips to the top of the World Trade Center and seeing the world from up there on top in that platform where you could be out in the open. I took for granted that skyline that I grew up. Then I got a call from my office, because I was still in the Marine Corps at the time, and I was on medical leave because of an appendectomy. And I got a call from my office saying I was needed at the commanding officer's office ASAP. So I remember being briefed about 4 of the planes and where they had been destroyed. And I remember the call to scramble all of our aircraft assets that we had in Buford to guard our borders, to be, for the first time in a long time, a defensive part of the Department of Defense. I remember the Marines out of Beaufort escorting 747s, 737s, 727s, 777s in our border and escorting them to land at Charleston Airport or land at Savannah's airport. I remember at the time everybody scrambling to find out where the president was. And if you remember, he was down in Florida here at an elementary school. And he was briefed about that. And I remember that for a few hours we lost touch with our president because they had simply tried to scramble him and get him to St. Louis as fast as possible. Even with all this information being poured at me and asking me for my unit's capability to support this aircraft that are being flown over the East Coast. And I had to turn off my Marineness all the time to think, how's Mary? I haven't talked to her yet. How's Jenny, my daughter? How's Will, my son? I haven't talked to any of them yet. I've been automatically pulled into, Gunny, what can you do to support these aircraft so that they can stay flying almost 24 hours a day? Then my mind started racing to my family back in Manhattan. My mother in what was at one time the Rheingold Brewery in Newark, New Jersey. She owned that building, and that's where she worked out of in a clothing industry. Thinking of her looking out her window and she could see the New York skyline on fire. Seeing the Twin Towers smoking at the time. Or my brother-in-laws, who were all construction workers in downtown Manhattan. And I knew that one of my brother-in-laws was actually down by the Twin Towers because he was working on one of the Twin Towers and worrying about him. I managed at a break to make calls after the CO had let us go and we all had a little break. I meant making calls and I reached out to them all. I called my dad and I reminded me that day that he was glad I turned down the orders only a month before to go to the Pentagon. Now, in all my years of being in harm's way, my father never said anything like that to me before. Nothing like that. And I wish you didn't go to Somalia or wherever. He never said that. But this was the first time he said, you know, I'm glad you turned down those orders to work at the Pentagon. Do you remember on September 11th how quiet it was that afternoon? The normal telltale signs of jets flying by, the white clouds, weren't in that sky that day, were they? It was quiet. It was eerie. I remember being at the air station in Beaufort, South Carolina, and normally all day you heard jets doing what we call smash and goes, where they come down, they practice landing on an aircraft carrier and take off. There was no sounds. Only the occasional sound of a fast mover coming in or a C-130 coming in and we refueling that C-130 and sending it back out to refuel these aircraft in air. Some of those pilots stayed up for 20 plus hours just to be refueled after refueled. It was different. It was so eerie. But all was stopped for that short time was an eerie time, a time of quiet, a time of reflection for most of us. I remember Frank Limehouse, who was our rector at St. Helena's in Beaufort. For the first time, he had opened the doors of the church during the day, not for tours of this beautiful building that was built in 1712, but for a time of prayer, a time for reflection. People were coming back. We looked at those first responders who, although scared, reacted to help others in need. We remember the scenes with police and firefighters and EMTs rushing toward those buildings as they were on fire. While everybody else is running the opposite way, they were rushing to these collapsing buildings, the Pentagon, or that burning place, that burning plane in that field in western Pennsylvania. We all watched with horror as we covered over, the smoke covered all of Manhattan, a coal field in western Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. Where were you when it happened? What were you doing? For most of us, it was a memorable period in our life where life had changed forever. That's what we thought, didn't we? Life had changed forever. We walked around less innocent that day, didn't we? Yet we were closer to our families. Do you remember at that time when outside in the streets, every house all of a sudden put an American flag up? Every house put an American flag up. Things had changed. You started to hear things like, "I love you," where you forgot to say it before. We learned that day how short life can be. We in many ways changed to become more like really Adam and Eve were, like before they ate from the tree of knowledge. We called each other. We openly cried. We respected each other. Someone cut you off on the highway and the first reaction was to tell that person off, but you held back on September 11th. You cheered and cried for our president as he stood in that burning pile of rubble talking to those first responders. You remember that? And everybody quieted down real quick to hear him speak. We all cheered for him. We looked with pride at all of that in authority that led this country through its toughest time. I remember seeing Mayor Giuliani, and for the first time, here's a typical mayor of a big city, but we looked at him as godlike. We kept him in prayer. The mayor of a city, we kept him in prayer just because of what was going on in his city. We watched with pride every time a fire truck would run off to a fire. We'd pull out of the way. No questions asked, we'd pull out of the way. And we'd even have prayers people would say as the fire truck went by, hopefully it wasn't another 911 that was happening. I remember at the Marine Corps Air Station Buford, folks would stop by and drop off food and movies to the fire station there. Make sure the firefighters were taken care of. Or we'd stop at Dunkin' Donuts and a police officer was there and we'd buy it for them. No questions asked. We were living a life of how God had originally wanted us to live on September 11th. To love one another, to care for each other. But then, what happened? Life went on, didn't it? The images of the Twin Towers were officially taken off the air, weren't they? You're very reluctant to find very many pictures of it nowadays. Most of the TV will not show the video anymore because of lawsuits and so forth that are going down by family members. Unfortunately for us today, we've slipped back to September 10th. That's unfortunate. We've slipped back to September 10th. Do you see how the September 11th, we were like God wanted us to be, our love of the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our spirit. We loved our neighbors as ourselves. To care for each other regardless of who we were and to take care of strangers and to love one another, didn't we? But then we got tempted, just as Adam and Eve were. We got tempted to go back to September 10th, and we followed through. That's why today, on this Sunday, we celebrate the anniversary of September 11th. We take time out to bless and pray for those who still live in September 11th. Those first responders who didn't care who you were, but they showed up for when you're in need. This is like Jesus Christ. He didn't know who I was at the time. I know he does because he's omnipresent, but he still went to the cross for me. An old retired Marine. He's like a first responder to me, like those police officers. He didn't ask questions, he just did. We need to keep going back to September 11th in our lives. We need to, every year, open our doors in prayer for thoughts, for remembrance, to ask God to bring us back to the way that we were after this tragedy hit our country. So as long as I'm the rector here at Epiphany, I know I will always be casting my shadow on the doorways of firehouses and police stations and hospitals, but not just on September 11th, I will keep that in my heart every time. I will keep that in my heart and my mind. So today, as we head out of here, rethink on how you've changed since September 11th, or who has brought you back to September 10th in your mind. What do you need to do to look around your world and to understand that you will never have a redo on today? Never. Who do you know that needs a friend, a hand, an ear, or what connection do you somehow since September 11th let get distant? It may be a family member, it may be a friend that you've let get distant. Go back to September 11th in your heart and renew that relationship that you've allowed distance or work to get in your way. Each of us is given a chance today to make a difference, to live a September 11th. So live today as if it were your last day. Live today as if you were being judged on how you lived on this day in your heart to be that September 11th. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.